What's going on, everybody? Today is day two of the P.Diddy trial. We have boots on the ground in New York City and in the courtroom. But coming up next is our legal representative, Mr. Gerald Griggs, president of the Georgia chapter of the NAACP and defense attorney here in the state of Georgia. And as always, we dissect these type of cases and we bring to you what we think is really going on legally and just from a media standpoint. So we got him on deck right now. So, Attorney Gerald Griggs, we are here. We talked about this case when it first started, some 3 or 4 months ago. I think the case kind of moved pretty fast, especially as it relates to federal court, man. Usually it doesn't move this fast. So
Yeah, I
here we
mean,
are, right? Second day of the trial. Tell us what your thoughts are thus far.
my thoughts are the trial is moving quite quickly. Like you said, in federal court, we typically don't move this fast from the search warrant that happened at his house to the indictment to ultimately trial. So it's moved pretty fast. But I think that a lot of the state's case they're putting forward. They put it forward, of course, in their opening statement, and the defense put forward their theory of the case. And now we're in almost three witnesses in now, and so it's starting to unfold. So it's been an interesting case to watch. Interesting defense. The defense is, he may have some interesting sexual proclivities, but it was all consensual. And so I'm interested to see how that plays out as the state tries to make it out that he uses his prestige and his money to provide sex in of course to facilitate his criminal enterprise. So I'm interested to see both sides and how they're going to play out with the evidence, but it's definitely compelling to watch.
I guess the question right now is freak or felon, right? Which
Yeah,
one is it, basically?
yeah,
Because if it's consensual, yeah, you may not agree with how he lives his life and his sexual behavior, but it's not illegal as far as what the defense is saying. On the other hand, freak offs are not illegal, but when you're talking about coercing people, drugging people, paying people for prostitution, I believe that's where it becomes dicey. I don't see where the RICO plays a part yet, because there's a lot of talk about sexual behavior. Now, you and I have covered cases as it relates to sexual behavior in the past. DA Fonnie Willis, it was a no there. You, of course, dealing with the R. Kelly situation. There were charges. So it's kind of hard to say how this whole RICO thing is going to play out.
yeah. So far, I haven't seen a connection for RICO, and of course, you have to prove a criminal conspiracy that's furthered by the acts of the defendant or other individuals. And so, like in Robert Sylvester Kelly's case, they were providing minors for sex and crossing over state lines. So you had the violation of the Mann Act, which showed there was a RICO conspiracy, him using his music to facilitate these acts. So we haven't seen that connection yet in the Sean Puffy Combs case. I really have heard a lot about domestic violence, a lot about prostitution, all of which would be state level charges. I haven't heard the connection that he's doing this in furtherance of a criminal enterprise. I'm trying to figure out what the criminal enterprise would be. Maybe they're trying to say it was his musical career or his producing career, but there has not been that connection yet, as it was in the Robert Sylvester Kelly case. So it's interesting to watch. But I think, like you said, it comes down to felon or freak. And I think right now they're proving a lot of freak. And that's not illegal in federal court. It is definitely illegal in state court if you don't have a consenting adult. And then, of course, prostitution is always illegal. So, unless they're trying to show that he trafficked these individuals against their will, which is exactly what his lawyers are trying to prove, this was not against anyone's will, it's consensual. I think that we have to see some more witnesses to see the state, whether or not the state can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt.
In order for there to be a conspiracy or a RICO case, right, there
Yes.
has to be other conspirators.
Yes, there have to be either indicted or unindicted co-conspirators who help facilitate the acts of the conspiracy, whether overt or covert acts, and then it has to be in furtherance of a criminal enterprise. So there are essential steps that the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, I have not heard them prove a criminal enterprise. What sounds like they're trying to prove are the overt acts of a conspiracy. So they have some more witnesses they need to put up. But so far, they haven't proven a criminal conspiracy. And usually you try to do that with the first or second witness. You don't really go into the acts until you have proven the conspiracy, because it can get, I mean, proven the criminal enterprise, because it can get confusing
Right.
if you don't do that.
It's interesting because I'm wondering if people who may have been co-conspirators, what about if the state flipped them as witnesses?
Yeah.
And so that's probably, or maybe why we haven't seen any indictments yet, because maybe they're participating. Is that a possibility?
That's always a possibility, but usually in the opening statement, the state will lay out what they believe the roadmap of the evidence is. And I think a lot of the roadmap in the evidence is the Cassie evidence and the Cassie tape, and then several other alleged victims. But there hadn't been a lot of corroboration of a criminal enterprise. And again, this is a RICO conspiracy case. Yes, the first few witnesses, they may have proven prostitution, they may have proven domestic violence, but those aren't the main charges. And again, in federal court, there's no law against domestic violence. There is a law against sex trafficking. So it's kind of getting confusing as we're watching this. But again, we're early on in the evidence. So I'm sure later on you'll see more evidence. And, I must say that, some of the lawyers on the defense side are doing a great job pointing out the inconsistencies. I think Attorney Steele did a great job yesterday pointing out the inconsistencies of what the security guard may or may not have witnessed, and then not calling the police, and then coming back a few days later and finding the tape erased. And then, of course, there was some allegation of money changing hands, but it allegedly didn't come from Mr. Combs. So there are a lot of inconsistencies we've already seen in the state's case. And again, all the defense has to do is poke holes in the state's case and show reasonable doubt.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see what's going on. A lot of people thought that this was going to be a slam dunk case because of all of the salaciousness that we've seen, or the raids of all of his properties. We were thinking that there was going to be some massive trove of video evidence, sex with celebrities and all of this stuff. And up to this point, there has been no mention of any of that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering, where did the case get lost?
Yeah, it's definitely less dramatic than we thought it would be from what we saw publicly available from the raids and the allegations of hundreds of hours of tapes. Now, there was a pretrial hearing earlier today where they said that they're probably going to let the press watch the freak off tapes, which should be interesting and salacious for media, but not quite sure what that has to do with a criminal conspiracy to traffic individuals, unless the people in the tape are saying they were not willing participants in the sexual activity. Now, that's different.
The defense is taking I think, a brilliant risk of saying that, yeah, this guy is not a good guy. In fact, he might be despicable, but he's not being charged with domestic violence. And there might be some statute of limitations as it relates to the state charge, right, in New
Yeah.
York City. So I think they're betting on and playing the prosecution, saying, hey, you guys are right on point when it comes down to this man not being a great guy, but you still have not proven yet, and there is no evidence yet that shows that this man has trafficked anybody, has anybody. These are all consenting adults.
But bringing this case in federal court allows the defense to simply say, yes, he's a bad guy. Yes, he's a domestic abuser, but that does not mean that he's a sex trafficker or that he has a criminal conspiracy to traffic in sex. If all of these individuals consensually engaged in this conduct, that's not criminal behavior. So again, it's different from Robert Sylvester Kelly, where you had multiple individuals coming and testifying that he flew them across state lines against their will for the purpose of sex, and they were underage. And so that's the difference. One thing I also note that's different is the minute by minute reporting on CNN of this case. I remember, in the middle of the Robert Sylvester Kelly federal case, you didn't have minute by minute coverage of major networks like CNN, like Fox. Of course, you had MSNBC and NBC that were present, but we actually have a ticker on the side of the CNN main broadcast that tells you the witness, the lawyer that's cross-examining, the prosecutor that's asking the questions, and minute by minute witness questions. So that's definitely new, and that shows you the high level importance of this case.
Speaking of CNN, in our first interview, when this whole thing broke some 6 months ago, I asked the question, why was CNN so instrumental in releasing the video in the first place? What do they get out of it? And I still ask that question today, and especially now as relates to what you just said.
Ratings. I'm sure the back end of CNN's website has never seen this type of traction. I can remember a reporter saying early on in the R. Kelly case, when they got over 20 million hits on the R. Kelly story on CNN, they'd never seen that type of web traffic on their website. So I'm sure that the same thing is happening here with a media mogul like Sean Puffy Combs. So I think that's what is driving this. It was interesting to see CNN break the video. My question is why the prosecutors didn't break the video and charges being brought in state court where there are laws that have been allegedly violated if what we saw in the video in fact did happen. And of course, I think in a courtroom now they've proven that those acts did happen. So that's a crime. It's just not a federal crime. In the level of evidence that comes out, I don't see a conviction in this case. And that's simply because of what we've seen in the first three witnesses. You can get a flavor of how bad it is in the first three witnesses. Again, going back to R. Kelly's case, the case was lost in opening statement when the defense team was basically saying he did this. Okay. In this case, you have a defense put up a very strong defense that this was consensual. There was no RICO conspiracy. There's no criminal enterprise. You're going to hear it from the government's own witnesses that they consented to this. Currently, in the cross-examination of Cassie, you're going to hear that, she paid for some of these activities. You heard that from one of the earlier witnesses. So they got a real issue of if this is illegal, then how do you have the witnesses saying that they consented to the behavior? But again, that does not say that this person's a good person. It just shows that there may not be the ability to prove to the highest standard in our laws, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that he did exactly what the government is saying he did.
So just like you, I agree that this case is not going in the favor of the prosecution right now. And if nothing else happens that is so monumental that it changes the minds of you and I, we think legally, you think more legally than me, but I have a broadcast mind and a legal mind as well. I don't see I don't see it. I don't
No.
see it.
And the people that I know that are in the courtroom, both lawyers and journalists that are reporting back out to me, are underwhelmed right now
Mm,
by the evidence that's being put forward. And I'm not sure, especially now, it just depends on how long Cassie's on the stand
yeah,
and how well she does. But her being the star witness, it won't go up from here. And
right.
so if she's the tip of the mountain and you can only go down, I don't see a conviction coming.
Yeah. I'll end it with this by saying domestic violence on any level is wrong. And of course, we're not condoning any of that behavior, but as a legal barrier for what P.Diddy, Dr. Love, Brother Love, whatever he's being called these days, what he's been accused of and charged of, they haven't met that bar. They haven't
No.
met that bar yet. And so, again, we're not condoning the behavior, but that's not what he's being charged with.
Yeah. And I'll just close with this. People have to understand that domestic violence is a serious offense. It's deplorable, it's horrific. But we're in a court of law, and a court of law is not about emotions or opinions. It's about fact and what the state can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And right now, the state is not proving the essential elements of the crimes charged. They're proving essential elements of additional crimes that they have no jurisdiction over. So what I would say right now is they need to shift to proving the criminal conspiracy and the overt acts of the criminal conspiracy for the charges they brought.